So welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Don, for organizing this, for Todd Gloria to be here and take time out of your very busy day. Thanks to everyone who's helped formulate these questions between our two organizations. Ojeni and Darwin are going to be moderating the questions, and perhaps Buki and I will pipe in. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box and I'll try to keep monitor of that. So my name is Doris Bitar. I'm the president of the San Diego chapter of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. The ADC is what we call it. It is the oldest, largest civil rights organization in the United States who are catering to Arab Americans as well as people who are confused for being Arab Americans. So Muslims, Iranians, whoever's confused. If you're dark Mexican, somebody thinks you're an Arab, we'll defend you. So it was started by Senator James Abarizik, who is a Lebanese origin. He was the senator of South Dakota. I don't know what he was doing in South Dakota. It's like a strange place for an Arab American to be, but he was. And he was known for writing the American Indian Child Protection Act in the late 70s. So he was with the Dakota tribes and he was working with them. And after that, he said, I think Arab Americans might need an organization like this, maybe not right now, maybe in the future. And so he was very clairvoyant that way, and he started the organization in 1980. So our roots are very humbling. They're about helping other brown people. And, you know, there's a lot to say about us, but that's not what we're here to do today. Maybe in the future, we can do a presentation about our community. So we're working with the Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego. It was impressed upon us when George Floyd was killed that the chokehold that was used against him was very familiar to us. In fact, it was a chokehold that's used against Palestinians by Israelis, and which is what prompted the question later on about who trains our police. Anyway, so it's a historic thing. We've never collaborated with the Racial Justice Coalition, and this is our first time. There are about 120,000 Arab Americans in San Diego County, although we are not counted because we are counted as Caucasian. And so that impacts an accurate number. So that's a very conservative number, but I don't want to venture and say, oh, it's 150 or it's 200 or California in general has about half a million, little under 500,000 Arab Americans, and most of us are in the South, just so you know. And the number of Arab Americans, if it is 120,000, and African Americans, it's about 150,000. So we've doubled our power. That's how I see it. And with that, I will have Buki give a little introduction and we'll start with the questions.
Okay.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Doris, for educating us about the history of ADC. My name is Buki Domingos. I am part of the leadership of the Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego that was founded almost 4 years ago around an issue that was known at the time on the streets as the chokehold. The technical or the medical term for that strangulation hold is the carotid restraint that has since been banned in San Diego. And we had a 3-year plus campaign that was known as the hashtag I Can't Breathe campaign. And we took it statewide, worked with Assembly Member Mike Gibson, and AB 1196 was passed a few weeks ago. And I believe that folks like Todd, yourself, we were on that committee as well. And I believe also having at least one meeting with your office regarding the carotid restraint in San Diego. I will go ahead and read our mission statement really quickly. And it states that the Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego provides a unified front for advocacy and action against all forms of discrimination and unequal treatment, particularly in our underrepresented and underserved communities, which are the Black and Brown. We specifically strive to challenge and transform the abusive law enforcement practices used in communities of color as we work with organizations, individuals to expose local racial abuses and inequities and to work to change the laws, policies, and unlawful police practices that allow for such abuses and inequities. The Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego, also known as RJCSD, is a coalition of 21 organizations and counting, and we have taken on a much more bold and new campaign, which is the hashtag prosecute or resign, that is targeted at the district attorney, Summer Steffens, and the 450 cases that she has not prosecuted in officer-involved shooting. And one of our questions, as you will hear today, is focused on if you will be giving us your support and help seek justice for these families. Thank you all so much for opening up this space, and I'll give it back to Doris.
Okay, well, I'll be here just a moment. Ojeni Touma, who is on our board, is going to ask the first question, and then she will alternate with Darwin. If you are not muted, and you should mute yourself unless you're one of the 4 speakers, just so we have good reception. Thank you. So Ojeni, go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for giving me again the opportunity to ask these questions, and I really look forward to hearing your responses, Mr. Gloria. So the very first question we'd like to ask is concerning April as Arab American Heritage Month. Mayor Faulkner has twice proclaimed April as Arab American Heritage Month in San Diego City, as have many other cities and states throughout the United States of America. Would you support making permanent the designation of April as Arab American Heritage Month?
Yes, I would. And Ojeni, if you wouldn't mind, you're welcome to call me Todd. In fact, I'd prefer that. But yes, I mean, and I think there's some intent behind the wording in the question, making it permanent, to the extent that you want to remove administrations or personalities and know that on an ongoing basis, it won't matter if you have a Republican or a Democrat, someone who's friendly to the community or not, that you want to see the city send this welcoming signal to the community. I think that's actually a really smart strategy. It is one that we increasingly are using in the legislature because we recognize that it often is dependent upon the majorities that are present or the executive that is in office. So if your intent is to try and do precisely that, I would not only support it, but I would recommend it. I think that takes what we should be moving towards, which is making recognition of our communities and our rights and responsibilities off the agenda, right? That it doesn't depend. I think a lot of us are, particularly in the last 4 years, have become frustrated that we continually have to assert and request our rights as communities. And by doing it this way, it becomes automatic, it becomes customary, and I think it therefore makes it more integral to the city. Again, making sure that it doesn't matter good year or bad, the city will recognize this. And while some would argue that's symbolism, I would say that's a preliminary step to doing the more important and intentional work that is necessary to get to the kinds of changes that I think you're looking for. So short answer is yes, and I hope that there's some intent behind that word permanent, which I think is a wise strategy.
Good afternoon, Darwin, Fishman, and I was about to say for Assembly Member Gloria, but if you prefer Todd, that's fine.
Yeah,
and we've certainly worked with you in the Racial Justice Coalition on the chokehold, and thank you for your support. First question for you I have is sister cities in the Arab world. San Diego currently has 16 sister cities. There is a sister city in Afghanistan. Iraq is an Arab country that was invaded by the United States under false pretenses. Would you propose adding a sister city in Iraq as the first step towards repairing relations between Americans and Arabs overseas?
I think that's a lovely idea. It's the first time I've heard it suggested. Given the recent history between our countries, I think that is is an appropriate first step. In terms of what I propose doing it, I would hope to do it with your consultation with the ADC and with others to identify the right city and then take the next step. If I can maybe just share just a little bit more depth on that, I would say that I was always uncomfortable when I was on the city council about the relatively limited nature of our sister city relationships. It essentially consists of the signage that's in the civic concourse, which we actually updated when I was on the council as seemingly a small step to try to make it seem more than what it was. I would hope to be a mayor that deepens these relationships a bit. And what I mean by that is that, the mayors of our city don't go to these places ever. In fact, it's usually the opposite. They come to visit us, and that doesn't feel like a reciprocal or equal relationship. When I was on the city council, and even for the periods of time when I served as council president, in the short period I served as interim mayor, we would welcome many delegations to San Diego, but we never seemed to make the same efforts in the opposite direction. And that is even including many of our partners in Mexico, which obviously would be relatively easy to do. I'm really hopeful that we can change that in recognition of the fact that we are a global world-class city and we should act accordingly. That I think our inability or lack of willingness to travel abroad, this isn't about junkets. This isn't about staying in fancy hotels. This is about recognizing that the mayor is the personification of the city, and that there is certainly a custom and a respect that is shown when that individual would make these travels. But also importantly, the kinds of meetings that we can get, say, for example, if there's a cultural delegation from San Diego, if the mayor went with that group, the opportunities that group would get, the meetings that would be granted would be different. And that's also true from a business perspective. I think that there is an economic development and a job strategy that would be here from having a mayor that's willing to travel abroad. And I want to be super clear. I would stay at a Holiday Inn. I would take Southwest Airlines if they went to these places. This is not about having a taxpayer-funded vacation. This is about, in this context, showing respect to these communities, but it's also about, again, competing on a global stage in a world that is increasingly interconnected, and recognizing that other cities do this, and that when we are not doing this, we are actually putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage, not just for the human-to-human connection that you're describing, but for that economic connection that ultimately brings jobs and investment to our community. So I appreciate you letting me kind of expand on that, because again, I think a lot of our current sister cities, despite the good work of our Diplomacy Council and the Sister Cities organization, you just haven't always seen a willing partnership from our city. And I think we could do a lot more to show this as being more than symbolic and actually trying to deepen that.
Yeah, thank you. Just also add real quickly, I'm really impressed with your answer. Usually it is very symbolic. I have a very good friend when I lived in Washington, D.C. She was the president of the sister city for Dakar, Senegal. And she actually talked about how leadership from D.C. would fly to Dakar every few years. And I just assumed that was just by herself and her own project. So that's actually really unusual. Most cities don't do that. So I appreciate your answer.
Thank you.
Our next question is about monitoring the city district attorney's record. In a Union Tribune article, there was a report on 25 years of officer-involved shootings. And the Union Tribune reported that out of 450 people that have been shot in that time period, no police officers have been arrested or prosecuted for any of these shootings. Based on this history, do you support our current district attorney, Summer Stephan, and what do you think needs to be done to ensure that there's oversight and accountability for law enforcement in San Diego from the district attorney's office?
It's a very specific and important question. I didn't endorse the district attorney when she ran in the previous election. Obviously we're gonna have to deal with this question in 2 years, and we'd have to judge on a record of success or lack thereof. And obviously the community is demanding more accountability. And so the question that you asked is, what would I do as mayor? So I think that a lot of it starts with actually the next question around Measure B, whether or not the city has the kind of independence to investigate officer-involved shootings and to collect information, evidence, et cetera, to make sure that, frankly, that good officers are cleared or bad officers are held accountable, right? And I think that there's an impression based on the statistics you just mentioned that there's never really a critical conversation that's had there, that officers are always absolved. And I will say that I think I first began to really understand this issue deeply with the killing of Ferdun. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his last name. I apologize. That's very disrespectful.
Nahad. It's okay.
Thank you. I just remember his first name. And being a city council member and looking at the closed circuit video of this and having tremendous concerns. And then of course the shooting was sustained. And I think that that's the case I can give you that I know enough about to have an informed opinion about, and recognizing that the conclusion that was come to was not one that I personally agreed with. And to the extent that if that is replicated 450 times over, we would have problems. I think that again, measure B and the potential for that passing, and for us to have the evidence, the investigations, the independence to be able to forward cases or not, would go a long way to being able to make sure that we are holding officers accountable. Clearly, the jurisdiction resides with the DA, and that's separate from the city of San Diego. But I would see my responsibility as mayor, as the overseer of the police department, or at least the person the police chief reports to, as creating the circumstances where we understand that we have a culture where we want accountability, where we're going to fund it appropriately and make sure that again, the information that can be provided to the DA is provided. At that point, then it becomes a question of engagement, right? Because the jurisdiction is the counties at that point. And so we have to do all we can on our side to empower them to make the decisions. Then you have to say whether or not you want to come out and say, hey, I think these officers should be held accountable. I think that there has been increasingly mayors who have spoken out in instances like George Floyd, where the officers were dismissed immediately. There's been some of that in other cases, but again, they're relatively rare. I would hope to be a mayor that would, when you would be confronted with something like the incident in the Midway area a couple of years ago, to speak out on this behalf. And that perhaps you'd start seeing some different outcomes. Lastly, I think in the nature of this question, who would I support in the DA's race in 2022? It would remain to be seen. I mean, I would be interested to know who would choose to run. As a Democratic elected official, I generally prefer to see Democrats in office. I would note that this DA is no longer a Republican, and I hope that that's maybe some sign that she's willing to be more supportive of progressive reforms like what we're seeing in other counties across California. If that were to happen, I think that would be a good thing. If it doesn't, that would probably inform my decision on who I would support in 2022.
All right, let me follow up with you before we get to the next question about Measure B. For the mayor, first, let me just get clear on what you said. You said replicated 450 times. I hope it wouldn't have to occur 450 times before the mayor would speak out in terms of shootings like Nihad.
That's not what I appreciate clarifying if that's what you took away from what I said. What I'm saying is that the 450 people that is mentioned in the question, I don't have the familiarity with all 450 cases, but with Nihad's case, when I, as a member of the city council, was given more information than the public had, at least initially, and then I think generally the public has the information that I had back then, that case was very concerning, right? There were no, the light bar on the squad car was not illuminated. It did not seem as though the officer identified himself as police. There was a significant distance between the officer and Mr. Nihad. Obviously, there was not a weapon that was involved. And so all in those in that particular case, I, as a layperson, looked at that and felt as though that was not justifiable. Now, of course, that was later justified and the officer was not held accountable. What I was saying was, if that situation is what happened over 450 times, that is absolutely unacceptable. But even the one case of Verdun's case, I felt that was difficult, that was also unacceptable. And a lot of the later bad relationship that I had with the police chief at the time really stemmed from that case where, the video, I think, told a very specific story, and that didn't align with what the arguments that the police chief was making at the time, that seemed to try and defend something that was hard to defend based on the video evidence that we were given.
Okay. And I'm take a minute on this because I'm also very familiar with the Nihad case. My friends were on the CRB. It was after I came in, but they talked openly about that case. So with that, and I agree with your assessment of it, then the issue then is, as mayor, would you be willing to speak out publicly, given that it's clear that the DA and other officials were trying to sweep that under the rug, and that was clearly a horrible shooting? and that there was no accountability for the officer, and the sense that would you be willing to go against the DA and potentially council members and other people and speak publicly? Because that wasn't done at that time. And part of what we're looking for then, of course, is a mayor that's got the courage and the willingness to speak out if there is something like a mistaken police shooting, or one in which it's something like we've seen before where it's assassination style shooting from the police.
Right. Well, and Darwin, that was, again, I think what I tried to answer, but I appreciate the chance to underline that again. I said yes, right? And I was referencing to other communities where we're seeing, even before an investigation, where obviously the officials that are involved have a lot of information, and the mayors have fired the officers, right? Really, again, signaling the accountability. Yes. And so I'm saying, and it's difficult because every situation is different, but to your specific question, if I saw something that I thought was indefensible, that I thought was wrong, I would speak out about it. And I guess that's a part of the experience I'm bringing to this particular position, right? After it took me probably longer than any one of you would care that it did. And I believe in being directly honest, right? I think a lot of times people in my profession try to excuse certain behavior. The city council meets every Tuesday morning in closed session. It is over a period of years where you start to see patterns, right? You see patterns of officer misconduct, and you start to sort of see some things need to change, right? And, I'm coming back to City Hall with that length of experience, and recognizing, again, patterns of behavior that transcend administrations, chiefs, and whatnot. And then also matching that with the public's request for change, right? I think that's what this year has been about. You see people of all communities marching in the streets saying, we want accountability. Now, often they're not specific in what they want. And I think that's a part of my responsibility, is to advance reforms that would make the situation better. But anyways, I'm sorry, I'm going on. Yeah. The simple answer to your question, yes, is yes, Darwin. I would expect to have that kind of, I would do that. And in the Verdun case, I think a part of that time was hoping that something more was coming out, and it never ever did, right? It was very difficult to justify, and yet we have a situation where it was. My hope is that with some of the reforms, both at the state level that I voted for, and then what may come on this ballot in November, that you would have a different outcome if that kind of tragedy happened again. Okay.
And then moving on to the next question about Measure B. If Measure B passes, new commission on police practices, what will you do to ensure that this new commission is set up and running properly? I understand you support it, and you're one of the backers of changing the CRB that we have, and I served on it. So we want to know, of course, because having the experience of being on the CRB, where the mayor, for example, starved us of representation, so we didn't have quorum. Like, the mayor plays a fundamental role in its success. So it's not just a matter of it passing. Is it going to be fully staffed? Is it going to be supported? What would you do to support this if it passes in November?
Right. Darwin, you're making the link that is important between these two campaigns, right? And I've said, and you can look at a lot of the debates, and we've had a lot of them. My answer is, not only do I support Measure B, but I'm committed to fully and faithfully implementing Measure B. And that is not an insignificant commitment, because, as I think all of you know, we are in an economic recession. The city's finances are not in a good place. And the IBA's estimate, the independent budget analyst estimate, is that the more robust review board is going to cost the city at least $1 million. My suspicion, having chaired the city's budget committee for 6 years, it's probably more. So when I say that I am fully committed to fully implementing Measure B as following the will of the voters, that is a significant commitment, because we're going to be in a position of dealing with a 9-figure budget deficit. But I make this commitment because I believe it is money well spent, and it's money that ultimately will save the city more money when we remove bad police officers from the department and avoid the litigation and the settlements that come from their conduct. So to be specific about what you're asking, Darwin, so fully fund it, to make sure we swiftly staff it. And again, these will be hard things, but I'm committing to doing it. So you might see reductions elsewhere, but again, I understand the voters' will is the highest in our democracy, right? And so you have to implement that. To your point about appointments, yes, because it's my understanding, and I haven't looked at the language of Measure B in some time, but I believe the mayor still has to appoint, right?
City council members will. It's a change. Yes.
Okay. 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 Thank you. But making sure, to your point about not starting the appointment process, I mean,
Right.
you know, this is a tactic that is used not just for the existing board, but for other boards in our city, and it does slow
Yes.
down progress. Listen, I'm not doing this from, you know, to hang out. Like I want to drive an agenda of change. So, you know, having fully staffed planning commissions and other review boards, as well as this one, is going to be important. And then a commitment to continuous improvement, right? I think what I know in my experiences, and again, I've been doing this work for some time, few things are perfect on day one, right? That through implementation, the introduction of personalities, you know, when you have new staff that are involved, you end up inevitably you discover things that were not considered, things that are not working well. And so you have my commitment to come back on a regular basis to make sure that we're improving it. Hopefully it wouldn't take another ballot measure because that's lengthy and can be somewhat expensive. But by making that offer and doing it here in front of all of you, that you can hold me accountable for, to say, okay, as it turns out, this particular process is not working effectively. This amount of staffing is not working right. This level of funding isn't working. That we would look for continuous improvement to make sure we're hitting the marks that, again, I believe what the voters are voting for, which is a greater level of accountability and transparency in law enforcement.
Okay, thank you. 6, the harassment of the unhoused, and 7, shaping of the role of law enforcement. And let me just ask then specifically, combining these, is for dealing with our unhoused population, as you're very aware of, I'm sure you got many questions about this, but one of the specific angles I want to ask about is the using law enforcement to solve this problem, especially in terms of the practices like citations.
Yeah.
And then things like passing sleeping bans, which does nothing to solve the heart of the problem, just passes it off to law enforcement and makes more people criminal behavior, like sleeping in a car. So I'm curious about how, with Mayor, what would you do to get us out of that? And what's the leadership you provide in terms of making sure that the city council doesn't get stuck in the current status quo, especially in terms of using the criminal justice system to solve our homeless problem?
I really appreciate this question or these questions. Let's try to follow Doris's lead here, because this, as you might imagine, the opposite is the common question that I get, right? Folks want to see, they're often frustrated by the homeless, and therefore they want law enforcement interaction, and I would disagree with that. Simply being unsheltered is not a reason to make them criminally justice involved. I don't support the vehicle habitation ordinance that was approved by the previous city council with the support of my opponent in this race. Sleeping in your car may be disconcerting to folks, but the solution shouldn't be to incarcerate them or ticket them and therefore put them in a position that it's less likely that they get out of their unsheltered status. The opposite should be the case, that we should engage with these individuals to find out why they're sleeping in their cars and see if there's ways that we can transition them out of that. So Darwin, you asked, I think, a specific question. I mean, I believe that we should repeal the vehicle habitation ordinance and instead embrace homeless outreach efforts that are not connected with law enforcement as a means of trying to address, again, why people would find themselves leaving in their car. Typically, in my observation, those are many times people who are low-wage workers, seniors on fixed incomes, and others who are economically displaced and should be in many ways a priority for housing, because with the introduction of affordable housing with supportive services, they typically can be successful in getting off the streets. With transitioning quickly into number 7, if that's okay, when I look at what I see as an actual area of consensus between the community and law enforcement is on a number of areas where we have asked law enforcement to take on these responsibilities, but the community is no longer comfortable with that, and I don't think, frankly, law enforcement is either. I think it starts with homeless outreach. There are other folks who are better trained to do that contacting, to building the trust and the rapport that we know is critical for convincing folks to get off the streets, accept services, and stay and get housed. Mental health emergencies, we send ambulances to deal with physical ailments, but we send law enforcement to deal with mental ailments. I think that is a betrayal of mental health parity, which is something that I believe in strongly. And again, as an area where we could send trained clinicians in to work with these individuals to try and take the temperature down and hopefully address folks. Going back to Ferdun's case, obviously he was understood to be a schizophrenic. My aunt is schizophrenic. I understand that behavior, and I recognize why sending law enforcement in often results in other outcomes than what we would expect in a civilized society. Truancy, recognizing that when our young people go out of school, again, the reasons behind that aren't necessarily criminal in nature. A social worker or another individual would be perhaps better to intervene, particularly to try and disrupt the school to prison pipeline that I think many of us have concerns about. And so when I think of those are multiple areas where we could see the introduction of other trained professionals that candidly would likely cost less than utilizing law enforcement. And hopefully some of those savings could be invested into things that could get to the root causes of some of this behavior that people are upset about, but our current approaches don't allow us to actually get to the root causes. We're just treating symptoms.
Thank you.
Sorry, I had myself muted. Okay, so continuing on the theme of law enforcement again, but specifically concerning the police chief, how will you evaluate current police chief Nisla and whether or not he succeeded or failed as chief? And then I'll just kind of swing into 9 as well. San Diego law enforcement, we know, cooperates with the Anti-Defamation League to train San Diego police officers, as well as their superiors in Israel and the West Bank. And we believe and we know for a fact that this creates bias and unsafe conditions in our city among Black, Arab, Muslim, Latinx, Indigenous, any vulnerable communities. San Diego police officers have observed Israeli military who utilize the native Palestinian population under constant surveillance as examples of terrorism. Will you direct San Diego law enforcement to stop training officers in Israel and the West Bank?
So a lot in there. Let me try and run through it because I know you still have more questions. So I have long had a relationship with Chief Nisla. He was the captain of the Mid-City Division when I was the council member for City Heights. And so we know each other extremely well. I've always had a good working relationship with the chief. And when I've needed to interact with him on issues that are either concern to me or concern to my constituents, I've generally had positive experiences. That said, I recognize and have heard plenty of feedback about the chief. And my answer to this question would be that he ultimately is accountable to his current boss, who is the mayor. And to the extent that there are areas where people would like to see improvement, I'm constantly taking in that feedback. Obviously, I'm very different than our current mayor. And my expectation would be for the police chief and frankly for every city executive and department head that if elected, we would sit down on probably the first day and I would share the vision that is what I ran on and on this particular case, supporting police reform and supporting an inclusive community where everyone feels welcomed and that they can belong in our city, and ask each of these department heads if they can support that vision. If they can, then they're welcome to stay. If they can't, we will find someone else to do this work. And again, that's not specific to just the police chief. That's true for every department head who needs to be on board with the vision, again, of what I've been running on, a big city that acts accordingly. So with regard to transitioning to the second question, I have long had concerns and objections to the militarization of our police departments. You may know I carried a bill in the legislature, AB 3232. We passed it through both houses of the legislature. It was vetoed by the then governor, which would have curtailed some of the militarization of law enforcement. I'm not familiar with specifically what's happening in the training in Israel. I'd like to know more about that. I recognize they have, well, I've never been, but I recognize they have police departments and they have a military. If that training is military in nature, I would have some concerns about that. I certainly support having our officers get training, quality training. I think that's important. I would recognize why that might be received differently by communities, particularly those of you here in the Arab community today. I guess I would ask you all to help educate me more about what's the curriculum that's being provided, who's providing it. I think that if with some more information, if it matched the long-standing concerns I've had about utilizing law enforcement as a military force, then I would probably say yes to that. But this was the first that I'd heard of it. And so maybe, I don't know, Doris, how we're doing on time, but maybe that's something that we can have a deeper conversation about in the future.
Absolutely. We'd love to talk to you more about that. And these are all longer conversations, and we'll continue them. You can just Google ADL training of American police, and you will get all these articles, including the ADL website, who brag about it. So, but we will have a longer conversation. We only have 15 more minutes. So
just before we leave today, because I will take you up on that, Doris, and Dawn, if we can follow up with Doris, that would be good. But what I was reading from the question, that this is training that is done overseas, is that the concern, or the training with ADL in general is a concern?
Here and there. May I just come? The ADL has two types of training. They send people at the level of the chief, assistant chief, and captains to Israel to be trained for a whole week in seminars on surveillance, counterterrorism, etc., and so on. And then what they do also, they import people from the Israeli military, Mossad, or the Israeli National Police to train our police people in America. As a matter of fact, they claim, according to their website, that they have trained about 23,000 in the United States at all levels. So basically, you, as Doris said, you can go ahead and Google that. And if you are interested, send me your email. I'll send you all the articles and the information that will be a little bit more focused rather than just having to go through a Google.
Okay, that'd be fine.
Also, George Corey, who just spoke with Buki, wrote an op-ed on this in June, I believe, and we can also forward that to you. And we have a lot of links. I mean, it's well established. And you know, the problem is the police is over militarized, and that's a link to why as well. And it links to other questions, coded hate speech. You know, but most cops come back here and will usually take it out more on the African-American community than on Arabs, honestly. But it's like everyone is fair game for that kind of militarization and hatred.
Yeah, and I would just also add real quickly, I have personal experience with it in Washington, D.C. with Police Chief Ramsey when he openly talked about going to Israel and he came back. We could see the strategies and tactics. He talked about what the police did based on that training. So I'd be more than willing to be a part of that conversation too. But it's also true that it was the Black community that we could see that change the most. So it's very interconnected.
So worthy of follow-up. You've heard the commitment already, so let's do that. I just want to be clear, and part of what I was reacting to make sure I got clarity is that I've been able to work with the ADL over many years on a multitude of issues, specifically around hate crimes. And Doris, like the setup at the beginning that you were describing with your organization, the sort of universal approach to that, you know, working with hate crimes based on sexual orientation, on religion, on race. And so, you know, that's where this piece into the militarization is what catches my attention, not so much the ADL's involvement, which again, I've appreciated the relationship with them, understanding how that connects to militarization and taking the law enforcement from a position of being guardians into being more of warriors. That's a concern.
Exactly, exactly. And the ADL has done some very good work, but they also, from our point of view, so much, but it's just time. The time has come. And the death of, the murder of George Floyd really hit at us anecdotally. The visuals of the neck, you know, the knee on the neck we got dozens of pictures of Palestinians in that same position. So it's like, you know, how pictures tell 1,000 stories. So that's what motivated us actually from that to reach out to the Black community here.
Well, let's follow up on this, and Doris, between yourself and Tammy at the ADL. I mean, I think I see people who are open and willing to have dialogue, and we're all learning and we're all trying to get better, right? And I see the role of mayor in many ways as being a convener and trying to make that happen. Going back to Darwin's questions before about, you know, how do we have constant improvement? How do we recognize that the world is always spinning and we've got to learn and do better?
And one context, sorry to take up all this time, but one important context is we've been at war in the Arab world for 30 years. And this influences our behavior there, and it is mirrored by our behavior here. And so can we reframe this in some way towards peace and not militarization. Anyway, I'll be quiet. Why don't you, Ojeni, maybe you should continue.
All right, so the next question I have, Arab and Black representation in San Diego. Arab and Black Americans would like to be involved in every commission the mayor establishes. Could you commit that to us today? Would you be mindful of the Arab invisibility and how it makes us vulnerable and unsafe? And then I would just add that for the boards and commissions, since the mayor does oversee that, what would you do to ensure diversity and inclusion for those? My experience with the CRB and then now with the Commission on Juvenile Justice for the county, both the city and the county, they are not diverse. So know what your role would be in helping to ensure diversity on boards and commissions.
Well, look, it isn't just boards and commissions or the CRB that's not diverse. There's never been a person of color elected mayor of this city, ever.
Right.
And so we have problems throughout the organization, and we have to do better. I do not represent that having me be elected mayor is going to cure this problem, but it's a symbol, and then we have to back it up with action. What I would say is that, when you have my lived experience, and if you're given the opportunity to sit in that chair, you're much more likely to be concerned and concern yourself with making sure that these boards are representative of the community, particularly the Arab and Black community. What I would ask of you, because I can't do it all, right? But I would ask of you is to be working now within the community to identify individuals who frankly are privileged enough to be able to serve on these boards, right? Darwin, you gotta take time off of work. You gotta take time away from your kids. You gotta drive down. You gotta probably pay to park. You don't get paid for any of this, right? It is a select group of people who can do this. And for a variety of structural reasons, oftentimes our community members are the ones that can't meet those thresholds, let alone the diversity part. So I think one of the important things that the Anti-Discrimination Committee and the RJCSD can do is to help identify these individuals now, so that when the new administration takes place, we have a group of people who have been vetted, who have committed, who can do this, right? I know that they can do it in terms of an intellectual capacity. My question is, do they have the time and the ability to do it from a life experience, right? So I believe that who I am and how I've lived my life gives me a greater ability to say yes to your question. What I need you to do is help me to be able to effectuate it by identifying these individuals, not just for CRB, but for the Planning Commission, for the Historic Resources Board, for the Urban Forestry Committee. Our lack of representation on all these boards means that our communities look the way they do, our kids are treated the way they are, and this representation piece is pretty darn important. It starts at the mayor's office, but it should filter its way down from there.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just also add real quickly, since you said vetted, and we're more than willing to work with you, RJC, on this. But I think it's pretty safe to say that when I was on the CRB, that I was the only one that had a criminal record. I've been in jail. And part of that vetting is looking at that, and also paying fines. So part of what I would hope is that you also reevaluate the vetting process and how to open that up in terms of allowing a greater pool of people to be able to participate in boards and commissions too.
Well, my vetting is not, what I mean by vetting, I'm glad that Darwin, you and I have this opportunity to check out some of this language, right? Because sometimes meaning is ascribed that is not intended. What I mean by vetted is that there are folks that share our priorities, share our vision for the city. I would suspect that there are people who would have points of view that you would not want on those particular committees, right? That's what I mean by that. In terms of patient status, your criminal justice involvement in the past, as long as they're not illegal in terms of actual participation, that is not my concern. What I hope most of anything is that they can meet their commitments. Because here's the thing: if you put appointees like this, and then they can't, that may be different in some way, and then they fail because they can't get the time off work, because the meetings are held at a time of day that involves childcare that they can't afford. It's that kind of stuff that sets us up for failure and allows the people who've held control to say, "I told you so." And that's what we can't do. You understand precisely what it takes to serve on these boards, the ability to fill out some of these forms and the disclosures that sometimes people aren't comfortable with disclosing. That's what I mean by vetted, to make sure that people are walking into these things eyes wide open so they can be successful, not vetted in so they can be excluded from participation.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to, I know we only have a few minutes left, so I just want to jump forward to a question that's extremely important and relevant right now to the Arab community, and that's on health data.
Yeah.
So Arab and Black Americans in San Diego have suffered disproportionately from COVID-19, especially in City Heights, which, as I'm sure you know, there is a huge Somali refugee population. And as the pandemic continues, the direct and indirect impacts are tremendously costly to our communities in many ways other than financial, and they have exposed racial disparities. So Arab Americans are the most frequently forgotten ethnic minorities, and I know Black Americans suffer statistically poor outcomes, especially Black women. So will you support adding a new race and ethnicity identifier on government forms, which is exactly what we're trying to do with the census, that recognizes Arab Americans in the city and county health statistics?
Sure, I think that's a reasonable thing to do, and I've tried to do this in the legislature. As many of you know, I'm a member of the API caucus. Disaggregated data is very important for our community. We've had mixed success with that, and so the answer is a hard yes. You can back that up with, again, my experience and sort of seeing that I've tried to do this in the past. So this isn't an empty promise. This is something I've worked on previously, and this would be a great time. I'm sure none of you need convincing, but I hope all of you are voting yes on Prop 16, which I think would further strengthen our hand and to be able to collect information, not just from a healthcare perspective, although I understand why that's important, but also from an economic development perspective. I want to acknowledge that the county and the state have more direct responsibilities around healthcare. Where the city can often be impactful is in economic development. And a concern that I have is that the millions that we spend often are not making their way to all corners of our community. And if it's not making its way to women-owned businesses, to Black and Brown-owned businesses, I have to suspect that Arab businesses, Muslim businesses are also being overlooked when looking at the opportunity to contract with the city and to benefit from the millions of dollars of that kind of spending. And Prop 16 will allow us to change some of that. So again, hopefully you all are voting yes on 16.
We got time for one more question. All right, let me go ahead and ask then about racial profiling. Will you work to end the current system for gang registration and gang injunctions? What will you do to ensure that Black and Brown youth are not racially profiled and disproportionately stopped, harassed, and arrested by law enforcement in San Diego, especially given the history of having the report on racial profiling that came out and it basically being rejected by the police department and the city council not able to come up with a plan on what to do with the report?
Yeah. Well, the answer is yes. And I would say maybe two things come to mind quickly. Number one is that, I've endeavored to try and answer this question with specificity and comprehensively because, it doesn't fit into a 30-second, 2-minute answer, right? It's complex. There's a lot in there. And so I worked and published my racial justice platform. It's on my website, toddgloria.com. It's an attempt to try and meet this moment of where people are, again, marching the streets demanding change, and it's sort of an expansion of what you just asked. And so I'd ask you to take a look at that one, just so you kind of see what we put out there, and it does address, trying to do right when it comes to gang registration and gang injunctions. Some of it may better complying with state laws, bills that Dr. Weber and others have helped pass, but also trying to take it a step further here locally, recognizing the way that gang injunctions are sometimes used, often sweep up Black, specifically Black, but often also Brown youth. The other piece of this, because Darwin, you were getting to the data point, is that we not long ago had a candidate forum with the Earl Gilliam Bar Association where a similar question was asked, and the comment back from another candidate was, well, I'm gonna have to look at that data. And what was disturbing about that is that we have the SDSU data from a number of years ago, we have the ACLU data from I think just last year ago, and so what more do we need, right?
Exactly.
And my answer was, listen, I got sat down when I was a kid and my parents explained to me how the world works. And so that's almost nearly enough data point right there to know how when parents know that they have to have that conversation, the SDSU and ACLU can provide additional data, but it only furthers what I already know, what we need to change. The last thing I would say, because I know we're running short on time, is, you kind of have to have like a litmus test, right, in a way. And the litmus test for me on this particular thing is that if we're not enforcing these laws in La Jolla, then we shouldn't be enforcing them in Southeast, right?
Exactly.
If you're pulling folks over in University City for this kind of thing, then you should do that in Southeast. But if you're only pulling them over in Encanto, but you don't do it in Torrey Highlands, that's a problem. And that message, and going back to the previous question of when you sit down with your department heads on day one and explain what we're here to do, what this mayor's administration wants to do, again, people will have the opportunity to say, I can get on board with that or I can't. And you recognize that those who can will be able to stay, those who can't will have to go find new employment.
Thank you.
Right, I think we should wrap this up. Doris, do you want to have?
Yeah, perhaps Todd, you would like to just say a few closing words, because we didn't, not campaign, not, you know, but maybe you have some closing words in holistic things just to say to us. And then, yeah, we're gonna say goodbye in a little while. And we hope this conversation continues. And thank you so much for taking your time to do this.
Yeah. Well, I would say a couple of things, Doris, and I do have to run. And I know Don's gonna get on my case here in a second, but I would just say, first off, thank you for your time. Again, you guys said more a few times, thank you for mine, but no, thank you for yours. This is my job. This is often your passion. This is your extracurricular. This is what you do because you are motivated to do it and your conscience won't allow you not to do it. And so I thank you for what you've done. I want to thank you for what many of you have done with me in the past. Buki working on carotid restraint, and you know, we had work to do in that regard, and I appreciate the grace that you showed me to learn and do better, and obviously then passing state law that I think is impactful. Going back to the previous comment, it's not about who's the person in the job. This is now state law, and that's a good thing for everybody. And then I guess I would say to you is my commitment going forward. Doris, I've already given you the commitment to make sure that we can sit down and talk about training and understanding what's going on currently, but I've built a reputation over the 12 years I've been in elected office of being one of the most accessible elected officials in this community. I don't think of this as a job. I think of it as a lifestyle. This is what I do every single day because I love what I get to do. I feel so fortunate to be able to wake up every day and just try and find ways to make my hometown a better place to live. And that's not going to change if I'm the mayor, okay? So we will continue to have opportunities like this to learn better, to learn more, and to do better. And I want to establish, we talked about a lot about policing in our city. I believe our objective should be to be a world-class city that is a national leader when it comes to policing, one that is meeting the expectations of the community in the 21st century. And I can only accomplish that through partnership with all of you. So I look forward to continued conversations about this. I'm hopeful that we can win this election in 17 days. We will make history in doing so. And I think that for a lot of our young people, it will be powerful to see someone that more closely resembles them in this highest office in our city, and that we can take this opportunity to be able to push an agenda that is a much more inclusive agenda and allow more young people like me. You know, I've lived the dream of this city. I'm the son of a maid and a gardener who's been able to sit in front of you this afternoon as one of two people who's gonna be the next mayor of this city. I've benefited from those opportunities. My public service is about making sure that those ladders of opportunity are there for our kids in the future. With your help, I believe we can do that. And again, I thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And I could stick around for a few minutes if people want to hang out a little bit, but basically this is the end. I'm going to stop recording, and we'll have it on our YouTube and on our Facebook page with a little intro and a picture of you, and then recording the evidence we're going to hold you to.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Doris and everyone, thank you for your time. Please excuse me, we have to go hustle to the next one. But again, I look forward to following up, particularly Doris, on the issue we made commitments on, and then on many, many things over the next, hopefully 8 years, okay?
We have many links to send you. We will.
Okay.
Yeah, Buki, did you want to say something, Buki?
No, it's perfect on our end, RJCSD. And like I always like to say to every elected official or somebody who's running for office, you are being recorded. We will show up. We will hold you accountable. And we hope that you'll be able to stand up straight and say, yes, I said this, and yes, this is tough, but I do want to work to achieve that goal. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Buki. All right, everyone, be well and stay safe, okay?
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.